Amelia Hartwell pressed her shaking hands flat against her thighs and told herself she would not cry. Not today, not in front of all these people who already knew what she was. Not a bride. A transaction. She had heard them whispering behind her back all the way down the church aisle, the Hartwell girl. Sold to settle a debt, and every word landed like a stone against her chest. She was 26 years old, and she already believed her life was over. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Amelia's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The church smelled like candle wax and old wood, and something Amelia could only describe as judgment. Every pew was full. That surprised her. She had expected maybe a handful of witnesses, the kind of quiet, forgettable ceremony you arranged when money was the reason and love had nothing to do with it. But no. Half of Harlow County had shown up, and she could feel their eyes following her every step like she was something strange and pitiful. A circus act they had paid good admission to see. She kept her chin level. She kept her shoulders back. She had promised herself that much. At least, whatever happened inside this church today, whatever bargain her father had struck without asking her, she would not give these people the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Smile a little, Amelia, her father had said that morning, adjusting the buttons on his coat in the mirror of their rented room. You look like you're walking to a funeral. She had stared at his reflection and said nothing. Because what was there to say? He had spent 4 years building up a debt so large that no bank in Virginia would touch the Hartwell name. He had borrowed against the land. He had borrowed against the livestock. He had borrowed against the furniture and the china and the portrait of her grandmother that used to hang in the parlor. He had borrowed against everything until there was nothing left to borrow against. And then he had borrowed against her. Nathaniel Caldwell had paid every dollar. In exchange, her father had offered his eldest daughter's hand in marriage. Nobody had asked Amelia. Nobody had thought to. She walked the length of that aisle alone because there was no one to walk it with her. Her mother had passed 3 winters ago. Her younger sister, Clara, stood near the back of the church with red-rimmed eyes and her hands pressed together like she was already praying for forgiveness on someone else's behalf. Their father stood at the front, beaming like a man who had just closed the best deal of his life, which Amelia supposed he had, and at the altar waiting. Utterly still, the way a man waits when he has decided that patience is simply more efficient than impatience, stood Nathaniel Caldwell. She had seen him once before, 3 weeks ago, when he had come to the rented room to sign the agreement with her father. He had been polite, formal. He had not looked at her the way some men looked at a woman they were purchasing, with hunger thinly veiled as courtesy. He had looked at her the way a man looks at a document he intends to read carefully before committing his name to it. Which was its own kind of cold. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual physical labor. Not just good breeding, dark brown hair cut close. Gray eyes that gave away almost nothing. He wore a dark coat and a white shirt, and he stood at the altar like a man who had stood in far worse places and survived. He was not unkind-looking. He was not particularly warm-looking either. He was simply there, present, resolved. When Amelia reached the altar and stopped beside him, he turned to look at her, not with triumph. Just a slow measuring look, the same look he had given her 3 weeks ago across her father's rented table, and then he faced forward again. The minister began speaking. Amelia heard the words distantly. The way you hear rain when you're inside a house, and there's nothing you can do about the weather. To have and to hold, for richer, for poorer, she almost laughed. For richer, for poorer. He was the richest man in the county. She was the poorest woman in the church. There was no for poorer on his end. There was only what he had gained, a wife with a respectable enough family name. Even if the family itself was in ruins and what she had surrendered. Do you, Amelia Rose Hartwell, take this man? She said I do before the minister finished the sentence. Not because she wanted to, because she wanted it over. Nathaniel said his own "I do" without hesitation, without theater, without the faintest trace of emotion crossing his face. And just like that, Amelia Hartwell ceased to exist. Mrs. Caldwell stood in her place. The carriage ride to Caldwell Estate took 40 minutes. They did not speak. Amelia sat on her side of the carriage and kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the Virginia countryside roll past the window. It was a beautiful afternoon, in the summer of 1817, the kind of afternoon that had no business existing on a day like this. All golden light and long grass and mockingbirds carrying on like they had not a care in the world. She hated every second of it. Nathaniel sat across from her. He had a leather ledger open on his knee, and he was reading it with the focused attention of a man who had a great many things to think about and very little time to waste on ceremony. After 20 minutes, Amelia could not stand the silence anymore. "You could at least pretend," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "Pretend," he repeated, "that this is a normal day. That we are normal people. That you did not purchase me the way you would purchase a horse." He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not offense. "Exactly, more like recalibration. I did not purchase you," he said. "You paid my father's debt. I settled a financial obligation that had nothing to do with you." The arrangement," she said quietly, "was made without my knowledge or my consent. So forgive me if I'm struggling to find the charitable interpretation." He closed the ledger. He looked at her, really looked at her, and Amelia braced herself, because she had seen what happened to women who spoke plainly to powerful men. She had seen her mother do it exactly once, in front of her father, and spend the next 3 days apologizing for it. But Nathaniel Caldwell did not raise his voice. He did not look at her with contempt. He said, "You're right. The arrangement was not fair to you. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." She blinked. She had not expected that. She stopped. Started again. "If you knew it wasn't fair, why did you agree to it?" He turned back to the window. The light cut across the planes of his face and made him look older than 38. Or maybe just more worn. Like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Because your father was going to find someone else," he said. "And I was not willing to let that be the outcome." Amelia stared at him. "You don't even know me," he agreed. "I don't." She turned back to her own window, her heart doing something complicated and uncomfortable inside her chest. And they rode the rest of the way to Caldwell Estate in silence. Caldwell Estate was nothing like she had imagined. She had pictured grandeur. She had pictured the kind of house that announced its own importance from a mile away, columns and iron gates and manicured grounds that existed purely to remind visitors of their place. What she found instead was a large, well-built working property that looked exactly like what it was. A place where serious people did serious work. The house was solid and substantial. Built from good Virginia brick, with wide porches and tall windows, and a kitchen garden running along the east side that clearly hadn't been tended to properly in some time. The drive was lined with old oaks, and underneath them, several workers paused in their tasks to watch the carriage arrive. A woman came down the front steps before the carriage had fully stopped. She was somewhere past 50, with iron gray hair, and the kind of face that had decided long ago that it had no particular obligation to soften itself for anyone. "Mrs. Walker," Nathaniel said, stepping out and offering Amelia his hand. "This is Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Walker, the housekeeper." Amelia would learn, looked at her with the careful, unhurried assessment of someone who had served this house for many years and intended to keep doing so, regardless of who arrived or departed. "Ma'am," she said. "Mrs. Walker," Amelia said. "It's good to meet you." Something in the housekeeper's expression shifted. Almost imperceptibly, like she had been prepared for something other than simple courtesy. Nathaniel spoke to the men who came to unload the carriage. He spoke to them the way Amelia noticed he did everything directly. Without bluster, giving clear instructions and expecting them to be followed. and then he turned to her and said something she had not expected. "Mrs. Caldwell is not a guest here," he told the assembled household. "This is her home. Her word carries the same authority as mine." "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Amelia stood very still. Her home. He said it like he meant it. She still did not entirely believe him. Because words were easy. Actions were what mattered. That night was the hardest, Mrs. Walker showed her to the master bedroom, their bedroom. The implication hanging in the air like smoke, and helped her change out of the wedding dress and into a plain white nightgown that felt like a surrender she hadn't agreed to. When Mrs. Walker left, Amelia stood by the window and looked out at the dark fields and told herself to be practical. To think clearly. To approach this the way she approached any problem that had no good solution, by identifying what she could control and releasing what she couldn't. She could not undo the marriage. She could not go back to before. She could not make this man into something he wasn't. And she could not make herself into the grateful, docile bride her father had apparently promised him. What she could do was survive. What she could do was endure. What she could do. The door opened. Nathaniel came in. He had removed his coat and his cravat. He looked tired in the way men look when they have been managing their own emotions very carefully all day, and the effort is finally beginning to show around the edges. He stopped when he saw her standing by the window. She held herself very still. She had spent the past 3 hours telling herself she would not be afraid. That fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. That whatever happened in this room tonight, she would get through it the same way she had gotten through everything else, by keeping her spine straight and her face composed, and never, ever letting anyone see how frightened she actually was. But she was frightened. She could feel it in her hands, in the shallow, quick rhythm of her breathing, in the way her whole body had gone careful and coiled, the way an animal goes careful when it cannot find an exit. Nathaniel crossed the room. He was close enough now that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes. Close enough to see that the gray of his irises was more complicated up close, not flat gray but layered. Like river water over stone. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he stopped. He did not reach for her. He looked at her face, really looked. The kind of looking that actually sees, and whatever he found there made him go very still. The silence stretched. "Amelia," he said quietly. She said nothing. "May I continue?" Forwards, and the entire shape of her fear shifted. Because in 26 years of living through her father's careless cruelty, and her mother's exhausted silence, and the slow, terrible unwinding of everything her family had been, no one with power over her had ever asked. They had assumed. They had decided. They had taken. But this man, this stranger who had purchased her family's debt and signed his name beside hers on a piece of paper that bound them together until death, this man had stopped. He had asked. She looked at him. Really looked, the way she hadn't permitted herself to look until now. Because looking meant seeing him as a person, and she hadn't wanted to do that. Had needed to keep him at the safe remove of captor and stranger, and the man who bought your life. She looked at him, and she saw something she had not anticipated. She saw that he was also afraid. Not exactly. But afraid of something, of this maybe. Of what they were to each other. Of the magnitude of what they had both agreed to stand inside. "No," she said. The word fell between them like a stone into still water. He nodded once, stepped back, crossed to the small settee near the fireplace and sat down. "All right," he said, that was all. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not tell her she was being unreasonable, or remind her of what her father owed him, or suggest that certain obligations came with the arrangement. He simply sat down. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small leather ledger and opened it. And for the next 3 hours, while Amelia Caldwell lay in the center of a bed that was too large and too unfamiliar, and belonged to a life she hadn't chosen, Nathaniel Caldwell sat 5 feet away and worked through his accounts in the orange light of the fire. She did not sleep until close to dawn, but she slept. For the first time in longer than she could remember, No one was asking her to be more grateful, more obedient, more accommodating of other people's needs. For the first time, someone with the power to take had simply chosen not to. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told herself it didn't mean anything. But the question followed her into sleep anyway. May I continue? 4 words. And somehow, though she could not yet have explained it to anyone, could not have made it make sense, they had cracked something open inside her. Something small, something she had not known was still there. Something that, in the months to come, would grow into the most dangerous thing she had ever allowed herself. Hope. The next morning came early at Caldwell Estate. Amelia woke to the sound of boots on floorboards and distant voices from the yard and the smell of wood smoke from a kitchen already at work. The settee near the fireplace was empty. A folded blanket sat at one end of it, neatly placed, as if he had folded it himself rather than leave disorder behind him when he left. She sat up. She put her feet on the floor. She thought, I am Mrs. Caldwell now. I live here. This is what is true. And then she stood up, because standing up was the only response to truth that had ever served her. She dressed herself simple, practical, and went downstairs. The kitchen was enormous and already full of activity. 2 women she hadn't met looked up when she walked in, their expressions flickering between wariness and something that wanted to be friendliness, but wasn't sure yet if it was permitted. Good morning, Amelia said. I'm sorry, I don't know your names yet. A beat of surprised silence. Mary, ma'am, said the younger one. Ruth, said the other. Mary. Ruth. Amelia nodded. Is there coffee, and is there anywhere I could find the household accounts? Ruth blinked. The accounts, ma'am? The ledgers. The household records. I'd like to understand how this place runs. Another silence. Longer this time. Mr. Caldwell keeps those in the study. Ma'am, Mary said carefully. I'm not sure. I'll ask him, Amelia said. She found Nathaniel on the front porch with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that suggested he had been awake for several hours already. He was watching 2 workers repair a section of the fence line at the far end of the yard. And he didn't turn when he heard the door open. Then he turned. He looked at her for a moment, taking in the plain dress, the practical hair, the expression on her face that she knew from long experience, read as I have made a decision and I would like to discuss it with you, and something shifted in his face. Not quadjacent to one. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. I'd like to see the household accounts. He was quiet for a moment. Why? Because I ran my father's household for 4 years after my mother died, she said evenly. Because I understand accounting and farming and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to keep a property functioning without enough help or enough money. And because she stopped, steadied herself, because you told them yesterday that my word carries the same authority as yours. And I intend to find out whether you meant that or whether it was something you said because it sounded correct. The silence that followed was long enough that she began to wonder if she had miscalculated. If she had pushed too hard, too fast, too plainly. If this was the moment he reminded her of what she actually was and what he actually expected of her. He looked at her steadily. Then he said, the study is off the main hall. First door on the left. The ledgers are on the second shelf. He turned back to the fence line. The coffee's on the kitchen table, he added, not looking at her. Ruth makes it strong. Amelia stood on the porch for 1 more second. Then she went back inside. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She found the study, she found the ledgers, and she sat down at Nathaniel Caldwell's desk in Nathaniel Caldwell's house and opened the books of his life, and within 20 minutes, she had found the first mistake. It was not small. It was not a rounding error or a missed entry. It was a pattern consistent, quietly compounding a peep in recorded in the wrong column, which meant the labor costs had been inflated on paper for at least 2 years, while the actual expenditures went untracked in the corresponding accounts. She sat back. She looked at the numbers. She thought, someone has been stealing from him. or someone has been catastrophically careless. Either way, he doesn't know. She picked up the pen. She began to work. 3 hours later, Nathaniel Caldwell walked into his study and found his wife of less than 24 hours sitting at his desk with 4 ledgers open, a page of her own calculations beside them, and an expression on her face that he would come to know very well in the months ahead, focused, slightly fierce, completely absorbed, and entirely indifferent to the impression it might make. He stopped in the doorway. "You've been at it since breakfast," he said. "Someone has been misrecording your labor accounts for at least 2 years, she said without looking up. "Possibly longer, but the earlier ledgers aren't on the shelf. The discrepancy, I can confirm, is just over $3,000. If the pattern holds in the earlier books, it's likely more." Silence. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between shock and a different kind of assessment, the kind that revised. "3,000, he said, "at minimum." He crossed the room. He stood beside the desk and looked at her calculations. She watched him scan them, watched him follow the logic of her work, column by column, and she saw the moment he understood. Saw it move through his face like weather. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat down beside her. "Show me," he said. And she did. They worked through the rest of the morning together. It was strange and ordinary at once, 2 people seated at the same desk, speaking in the clipped practical language of numbers and records. Neither of them acknowledging the strangeness of what they were doing, what had happened in this house the night before. But something was different. Something had shifted in the 12 hours since she had stepped out of that carriage. He had asked. She had answered. He had listened. And now in this study, over these ledgers, in a marriage that had begun as a transaction, they were, for the first time, doing something that looked almost like partnership. She did not let herself put a name to it, not yet. But she noticed it. She noticed it the way you notice the first small change in the weather before a long rain, not with drama, not with certainty, just with the quiet animal awareness that something has shifted, that the air is different than it was, that the world is moving in a direction you hadn't planned for. She picked up her pen. She turned to the next page. "There," she said, pointing. He leaned in to look. "There," he agreed, and they continued. The ledger mistake was not an accident. Amelia knew it the moment she found the third discrepancy. 1 error was carelessness. 2 errors were negligence. 3 errors, all in the same column, all in the same handwriting, all dating back to the same 6-month period 2 years ago, were a pattern. And patterns, in Amelia's experience, were never innocent. She set down her pen. "Nathaniel." He looked up. She had started using his given name sometime in the middle of the morning without either of them remarking on it. And he had not corrected her. "These entries," she said, turning the ledger so he could see, "they're not mistakes." He looked at the column, then at her. "The amounts are too consistent. If someone were simply careless, you'd see variations, some months worse than others. Random errors in different directions. But these," she traced her finger down the column. "Every single month, the labor costs are inflated by almost exactly 15%. Then the difference disappears into this account here." She pointed to a secondary column labeled Miscellaneous Supply. Whoever did this wasn't confused. They were careful. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. "Thomas Wren," Nathaniel said. "Not a question. Who is Thomas Wren?" "My former accounts manager." He stood up from the chair, walked to the window. "He left the estate 8 months ago. I assumed he found better employment elsewhere." "Did you check his references before he left?" "I did not ask for them. I was occupied with other matters." A pause. "He had been with the estate for 6 years. I trusted him." Amelia watched his back, watched the way his shoulders sat square, controlled, carrying the particular kind of tension that came from a man who blamed himself for things that had not been his fault. "You trusted someone who had given you 6 years of service," she said. "That's not foolishness. That's reasonable. He turned to look at her. It cost me $3,000. It cost you $3,000 that I just found, she said. Which means you can pursue the recovery. Do you have a solicitor in town? Another beat of silence. Longer this time. Yes, he said. Harlan Moore. He handles the estate's legal matters. Then you should speak with him this week. She closed the ledger and stacked it neatly with the others. I'd like to review the remaining books before you do. If the pattern extends further back, the amount recoverable will be larger. And Mr. Moore should have the complete picture before he advises you. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was doing something complicated, something she couldn't fully decode yet, because she didn't know him well enough to read the subtler registers of his face. But there was something there that looked almost like it had been startled into being. All right, he said. All right, she agreed and reached for the next ledger. By Thursday of the first week, Amelia had worked through all 7 remaining ledgers. The total discrepancy was $4,800. She wrote up a clean summary 3 pages organized by year and account category and left it on the desk with a note that said for Mr. Moore's review in her clear, careful handwriting. When Nathaniel found it that evening, he stood in the doorway of the study for a full minute before he picked it up. She was in the kitchen when he came to find her. Ruth had been teaching her which suppliers the estate used for dry goods, and Amelia had been making her own notes about which contracts looked overpriced compared to what she knew from managing her father's household. You finished, he said. Yes. He looked at the papers in his hand. Then at her, this is thorough. I wasn't certain how much detail Mr. Moore would need, she said. I'd rather give him too much than too little. He set the papers on the kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment. In that way he had not uncomfortable silence, but the kind of silence that meant he was choosing his words rather than simply producing them. Why did you do this? He asked. She looked at him. Because it needed doing. You've been here 4 days. Yes. Most women in your position would be stopped. Decorating, she offered. Something moved across his face. Almost humor. I was going to say adjusting. I adjust by working, she said. It's the only way I know. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the papers again. I'll ride into town tomorrow morning and speak with Moore, he said. If you're willing, I'd like you to come. You understand these numbers better than I do. And if he has questions, I'll come, she said, before he finished the sentence. He nodded once, started to turn away Nathaniel. He looked back. The dry goods contracts, she said. There are 3 of them that are significantly above market rate. I'd like your permission to renegotiate them. The pause that followed was the longest yet. And then Nathaniel Caldwell, 38 years old. Former military officer, wealthiest man in Harlow County. Master of 4,000 acres of Virginia land, said. Do what you think is best. Amelia turned back to her notes. She didn't let him see her smile. Town was a different kind of test. She felt it the moment the carriage rolled down the main street of Harlow, Virginia, the shift in the air, the way conversations paused and eyes followed. People who had watched her walk down that church aisle a week ago, knowing everything about how she'd come to be there, watching now to see what kind of woman she would turn out to be. She kept her chin level. She kept her shoulders back. Same as always. Harlan Moore's office was above the dry goods store on Merchant Street, a small, organized space that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Moore himself was a compact man in his 60s with sharp eyes and the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent 40 years listening to people's problems and learning not to be surprised by any of them. He shook Nathaniel's hand. He nodded at Amelia with the polite restraint of a man who wasn't quite sure yet what category to put her in. Then Nathaniel said, My wife discovered a significant accounting irregularity in the estate records. She's prepared a full summary for your review. Amelia set the 3 pages on Moore's desk. He picked them up. He read them not quickly, not performing a quick scan, but actually reading, and she watched his expression move from polite attention to focused interest to something that looked like genuine surprise. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, looking up. "You prepared this yourself?" "Yes. And how long?" "4 days." He looked back at the papers. "This is meticulous work." "Thank you." He looked at Nathaniel. "She's right about the recoverability. If these entries hold up under examination, Wren is liable for the full amount plus damages. I can file the appropriate claim by the end of the week." "Do it," Nathaniel said. Moore nodded. Then he looked at Amelia again, and this time the look was different. Not the polite restraint of before, something that had revised itself. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "It's a pleasure to have you in Harlow," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Moore. I hope to make myself useful." On the way back to the carriage, Nathaniel walked beside her without speaking. The street was busy with mid-morning activity, merchants and farmers and women with market baskets, all of them very carefully not staring. Then a voice called out from the porch of the general store. "Caldwell." A man stepped down from the porch. He was around Nathaniel's age, heavier, with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors and a lot of evenings indoors. He wore a good coat and a proprietary expression that Amelia disliked immediately. "Randall," Nathaniel said. Not warmly. "Heard you came in with the new wife." Randall's eyes moved to Amelia with the unhurried boldness of a man who had never been corrected. "The Hartwell girl." "Mrs. Caldwell," Nathaniel said. His voice was enthralled, but something had gone very still in him. Randall smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, of course. "Quite the arrangement your father made for you, ma'am." "Worked out well for the Hartwells, I reckon." Amelia met his gaze. She felt the familiar cold settle into her chest, the shame reflex. The instinct to shrink, to deflect, to apologize for existing in a context that embarrassed people. She ignored it. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I'm finding it works out rather well for the Caldwells, too." "Good morning, mister." "A beat, Randall Hatch," the man said. Slightly thrown, Mr. Hatch. She inclined her head with the exact degree of courtesy required, and no more. "Do excuse us. We have several more errands to see to." She walked toward the carriage. After a moment, Nathaniel fell into step beside her. "When they were out of earshot," he said, very quiet. "That was well handled." "He was trying to embarrass me," she said. "Yes, I've been embarrassed by better men than Randall Hatch." She said it matter-of-factly. Without self-pity, without drama, just a statement of fact. The way you state that it rains sometimes or that roads are bad in winter. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should not have had to deal with that." "No," she agreed. "But I did. And I will again, probably. It's all right." She glanced at him. "Are you going to tell me not to speak to men like that in public?" He looked at her. The almost humor was back. "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you that you are considerably more capable of handling yourself than I gave you credit for." She climbed into the carriage. "Most people are," she said, "when someone gives them the chance." The week settled into a rhythm that Amelia had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. She woke early, she worked. She ate breakfast with Nathaniel in the dining room. Not the formal dinner party kind of breakfast, but the practical, pre-dawn kind, with coffee and whatever Ruth had prepared, and the day's tasks laid out between them like a shared map. They talked about the estate, about the accounts, about the 3 dry goods contracts she was renegotiating, about the workers, about the Southfield drainage problem that had been quietly worsening for 2 seasons. She had not expected to find a partner in conversation. She had not expected to find someone who asked her opinion and then actually waited for the answer. But Nathaniel had a quality she was slowly learning to recognize, a quality of genuine attention, the kind that was rare in men of his position and his era, the kind that did not perform listening but actually did it. When she spoke, he heard her. When she made an argument, he engaged with it. When she was wrong, he said so directly, without condescension, and when she was right, he acknowledged it the same way. It was more unsettling than cruelty would have been. Cruelty she knew how to navigate. This she didn't have a map for. There was an afternoon in the third week, the afternoon that later she would identify as the moment something irrevocable began, when she was in the stable yard arguing with the feed supplier about pricing. And she heard a commotion near the east fence. One of the younger workers, a boy of about 16 named Joseph, had fallen from the fence he'd been repairing. He'd gone down hard, and by the time Amelia crossed the yard, he was sitting in the dirt, holding his arm at an angle that made her stomach turn. She knelt beside him before anyone else reached him. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Joseph, look at me." The boy was pale and shaking and trying not to cry, which was making everything worse. "I'm looking," he managed. "Good. Tell me where it hurts, my arm." I think it. Don't look at it," she said firmly. "Just at me." She kept her eyes on his face, kept her voice level, kept the alarm completely out of it, because she had learned that the sound of calm was more useful than almost anything else in a moment of crisis. "I'm going to need someone to ride for the doctor." "Can someone already sent?" said a voice behind her. Nathaniel had come across the yard without her hearing him. He crouched on the boy's other side, and she saw the way Joseph's breathing eased slightly just from the presence of the two of them, one on each side. Solid and calm. "You're going to be all right," Nathaniel said to the boy. "Moore's boy can ride fast. The doctor will be here within the hour." "Yes, sir." "Does your mother know where you are today?" "Yes, sir. She knows I'm working the east fence." "Good. One of the men will ride out and let her know you're here and you're being seen to, so she won't worry." Joseph blinked, like the idea that someone would think to do that, to think about his mother worrying. To send word without being asked was not something he had anticipated. Amelia felt it too. She sat in the dirt of the stable yard beside this injured boy while the afternoon sun moved overhead, and she watched Nathaniel Caldwell talk the fear out of him calmly, practically, with the complete attention of a man who was not thinking about anything else in the world at that moment, and something in her chest moved that she had not given permission to move. She pressed it back down. Not yet, she told herself. She didn't know what yet meant. She only knew it wasn't now. The doctor came. The arm was broken. Joseph's mother arrived 40 minutes after the rider went to fetch her, a small woman, with calloused hands and frightened eyes, who went immediately to her son, and then looked up at Amelia with an expression that was half gratitude and half a kind of bewildered relief. "Thank you," she said, "for staying with him. He was very brave," Amelia said. "You should be proud of him." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You're the new Mrs. Caldwell." "Yes," they said. She stopped. Started again. Some folks in town were saying another stop. "I'm glad you're here, ma'am. That's all I wanted to say." She turned back to her son. Amelia stood and walked back toward the house, and she did not let herself think too carefully about what some folks in town were saying meant, because she already knew what it meant. She had been married to a wealthy man's money in a county that had watched it happen. She knew exactly what they were saying. She knew, and she could not stop them. What she could do, the only thing she could do, was be so clearly herself, so plainly capable and present and real, that the story they told about her eventually had to make room for the truth. That was all. That was enough. She went back to the accounts. The first time she and Nathaniel argued was over the south field. He wanted to replant it with tobacco. She thought the soil needed a season of rest first, possibly two, and that pushing a cash crop through already depleted land was the kind of short-term decision that looked logical in a ledger and was catastrophic in practice. They were at the breakfast table. It was 6 in the morning. He had the planting records in front of him, and she had the soil notes she had been gathering from conversations with the older farmhands. "The men say the south field has been planted through for 9 consecutive seasons," she said. "The men are farmhands, not agricultural economists. The men," she said, "have been working that particular piece of ground for 9 years, and they know what it looks like when the yield starts dropping. And they say it started dropping 3 seasons ago. A bad year, 3 consecutive bad years in the same field is not weather, she said. You know that. He looked at her across the table. The estate needs the tobacco income. The estate will need it more in 2 years if that field gives out entirely. She held his gaze. I understand the financial pressure. I've read every ledger in this house. Remember? I know what this season needs to produce. But I also know that killing the field to save this year's numbers means you lose the field and you lose the income. You'd be borrowing from yourself. The silence was long. He looked at the planting records, then out the window, then back at her. What would you put in it instead, he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. Winter wheat, she said. Lower revenue, but it restores nitrogen. 1 season of wheat. Then a spring fallow. Then the south field gives you better tobacco than you've had in a decade. That's 2 years of reduced yield from that field. Yes. The accounts won't. I've already identified 3 areas where we're overpaying for services, she said. If we renegotiate those contracts before autumn, the savings offset the reduced south field yield for this year. Next year we're closer to even. Year 3 we're ahead. She pulled her notes across the table and turned them so he could read them. The math works. I checked it twice. He looked at her notes. He read them, column by column. The way she had shown him to read the ledger discrepancies. When he looked up, his expression had done that thing again, that complicated thing she was slowly learning to recognize as the look of a man having his assumptions revised in real time. You did this last night, he said. After dinner. Yes. Why didn't you mention it sooner? Because I wanted to be sure before I said anything. She met his eyes. I don't argue a position I'm not certain of. He was quiet. Then winter wheat. He closed the planting records. I'll talk to the men, he said. She nodded and picked up her coffee. He watched her for a moment, that careful, quiet watching of his. You ran your father's farm, he said. I ran what was left of it. Yes. For how long? 4 years. My mother got sick in the winter of 1813. After that it was mainly me. She set down the cup. My father was good at acquiring things. He was less good at managing them. A pause. I'm sorry about your mother, he said. She looked at him. It was a simple statement, 4 words. No ceremony, and somehow that was exactly why it landed the way it did. Thank you, she said. They finished breakfast in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the carriage ride on their wedding day. That silence had been 2 people carefully not touching. This one was 2 people who had said what needed saying and were comfortable letting it settle. She noticed the difference. She didn't remark on it. But she noticed. It was Mary who told her about the first wife. Amelia had been at Caldwell Estate for just over a month when Mary mentioned it, not deliberately. Not as gossip, but in the way that things come out when 2 people have spent enough time working alongside each other that the normal social filters start to relax. They were preserving the kitchen garden harvest rows of glass jars. Hours of careful work, and Mary had been quiet for a while when she said, He used to smile more before. Amelia kept working. Before what? Before Mrs. Caldwell, the first Mrs. Caldwell passed, a pause. And the baby. It was a hard time for this house. Amelia's hand stilled on the jar she was holding. I didn't know, she said carefully. I don't suppose he would have told you. Mary's voice was quiet. Careful, the voice of someone who respected a person's privacy and was uncertain whether she was overstepping. It was 4 years ago. Fever took her in the summer. And the baby, she stopped. The baby didn't make it. Amelia set the jar down. She thought about the settee near the fireplace, about the way he sat in the dark and worked without complaint, about the quality of his solitude, not cold, not cruel, but worn, like a man who had learned to exist in a smaller space than he'd once needed. He carries it, she said. It wasn't a Yes. Ma'am, he does. She picked up the jar again. She thought about what it meant to lose a wife and a child in the span of a summer. To go on running 4,000 acres and a household, and a life that had been built for a future that no longer existed. She thought about the question he had asked her on their wedding night. "May I continue?" And she thought, that is not the question of a man who believes he owns me. That is the question of a man who has lost something and is terrified of becoming a person who takes instead of asks. She didn't say any of this to Mary. She filed it carefully in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered. That evening, she went to find him. He was in the stable, not working, just standing near his horse, one hand on the animal's neck, in the posture of a man who had come somewhere quiet to breathe. The horse, a dark bay called Major, stood with the uncomplicated patience of animals who understand that sometimes people just need to stand next to something warm and breathing. He heard her turn right away. "Mary told me," Amelia said. He was quiet for a moment. Then I figured she would eventually. "Does it bother you?" That she did? He turned to look at her. The stable light was low and golden, and in it he looked older again, or not older exactly, but more fully himself than he usually let her see. "No," he said, "it's not a secret. It just isn't something I talk about." She came to stand on the other side of Major, her hand finding the horse's flank without thinking. "You don't have to talk about it now. I know. I just wanted you to know that I knew." She kept her eyes on Major. "And that I'm sorry. 4 years ago is not long."
No, he said.
"It's not." Silence. Then he said quietly, "I thought if I married again, if I made it about the estate, about practical necessity, I could do it without—" He stopped. "Without risking anything," she said. He looked at her across the horse's back. "Yes," she held his gaze. "I understand that," she said. "I entered this marriage trying to feel as little as possible too." He was very still. "And now," he said. The question caught her off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, it wasn't, but because he was asking it plainly, without armor, without the measured distance he usually maintained. And she found that her practiced ability to deflect was entirely absent. "Now," she said carefully, "I think we may have miscalculated." He looked at her for a long moment. Major shifted his weight between them, impatient with the stillness. "Yes," Nathaniel said quietly, "I think we may have." She turned and walked back toward the house. She did not run, but she walked quickly, because her heart was doing something completely unauthorized and she needed to be somewhere private before she let herself examine what it was. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday. She recognized the handwriting before she opened it, the same Lupin, self-important script he'd been using since she was a child. The handwriting of a man who had always believed his words deserved more space than they required. She opened it at the breakfast table after Nathaniel had ridden out to the south field. "My dear Amelia, I trust you are settling into your new situation satisfactorily. I write because I find myself in some financial difficulty once again, and as you are now positioned within the Caldwell household, I believe a small request would not be unreasonable." She stopped reading. She set the letter down. She sat with it for a full minute, sat with the anger that was clean and familiar, and the grief underneath it that was not clean at all, and the exhaustion of being someone's asset for so long that they could not even imagine you might have stopped being available for that purpose. Then she folded the letter and put it in her pocket. When Nathaniel came in at midday, she was in the study with the ledgers. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her face. She looked up. She had not planned to tell him. She had planned to handle it herself. Quietly, the way she handled everything alone, efficiently, without burdening anyone else. But he was looking at her with that attention of his, that real, genuine attention, and she found for the second time that week that her usual defenses were simply not where she had left them. She took the letter from her pocket and held it out. He crossed the room. He took it. He read it, his expression going still, then very controlled, in the way she had learned meant he was managing anger. He folded it carefully. He handed it back. "How do you want to handle this?" he said. "Not I will handle this. Not don't worry about it. Not a decision made on her behalf without consultation. How do you want to handle this?" She looked at him. "I want to write back," she said. "I want to be clear with him. And I don't want you to intervene unless I ask you to." He nodded. "All right. All right," she said. She pulled out a sheet of paper. She picked up the pen. She began to write, and the letter she wrote was the clearest thing she had ever put on paper, clear and quiet and final. The letter of a woman who had decided that the person she was becoming did not owe anyone her diminishment. When she finished, she read it over once. Then she sealed it and handed it to the houseboy to post. When she looked up, Nathaniel was still in the doorway. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. Something moved across his face. "Good," he said. He went back to work. She sat at the desk for another moment. The seal of the letter still warm in her fingers, and she let herself feel just for a moment, just briefly, what it was like to stand in a room where someone had asked, "How do you want to handle this?" and meant it. It felt like something she hadn't known she was building toward. Like a door she hadn't known was there until she found herself standing directly in front of it. She was not ready to open it yet, but she was no longer pretending it didn't exist. The reply from her father arrived 11 days after she sent her letter. Amelia recognized that she had been waiting for it, not consciously. Not in the way you wait for something you want, but in the low-level vigilant way you wait for a storm you can smell coming, but cannot yet see. She had gone about her days, reviewed the accounts, renegotiated the second dry goods contract, ridden out to check the winter wheat planting in the south field. She had done all of it with the particular focused calm of a woman who has learned that productivity is the best armor against dread. But she had been waiting. The letter came on a Thursday morning while Nathaniel was in town meeting with Harlan Moore about the Wren recovery case. She opened it at the kitchen table with Ruth pretending not to watch from across the room. The first line told her everything. "Since you have chosen to forget your obligations to your family, I have taken the liberty of coming to Harlow to remind you of them in person." She read it twice, then she set it down and said very quietly, "Ruth." "Ma'am?" "Yes." "Ma'am, thank you." She drank the coffee. She refolded the letter. She put it in her pocket and went to find Mrs. Walker. Because there were linen inventories to complete, and she had learned that the best way to manage her father was to be completely unsurprised when he arrived. He was already in the county. She could feel it. He arrived the next afternoon. She was in the front garden when the hired carriage came up the drive, not Caldwell's carriage. Not any vehicle that belonged to a man of means, but a dusty rented thing with a tired horse and a driver who looked like he had been paid just barely enough to make the trip. Her father stepped out looking exactly as he always did, prosperous on the surface, fraying at every edge, wearing the confidence of a man who had never once in his life accepted that his failures were his own. Edward Hartwell was 53 years old and handsome in the way that certain men are handsome when they are young and then carry the architecture of that handsomeness into age without the substance to support it. He had Amelia's brown hair, or she had his. She had never liked thinking about that. He had a politician's smile and a merchant's eye and a gambler's relationship with consequences. Which was to say, he believed consequences, which always something that happened to someone else. Amelia. He spread his arms as though she had been the one to go looking for him. "My dear girl." She did not move toward him. "Father," she said. He came to her and took her hands and pressed them and looked at her with the particular expression he deployed when he needed something warm. Injured, faintly accusatory, all at once. "You look well. The Caldwell air agrees with you. You should have told me you were coming," she said. "I wrote. You wrote to tell me you were already on your way." "That's not the same thing." He waved a hand. "I didn't think it would matter. We're family." He looked past her at the house with an appraiser's eye, that quick, calculating sweep she had watched him perform on every property he'd ever set foot in. "The estate looks good. He's kept it up well. We've Kept it up well, she said. He looked at her. A small recalibration, of course. Nathaniel is in town. He'll be back by evening. She stepped back because he was still holding her hands and she wanted them back. Come inside. Ruth will bring coffee. She took him to the formal sitting room, not the study. Not the breakfast room. Not any of the rooms where she and Nathaniel had built their ordinary days together. The formal sitting room was correct and proper and exactly the right distance. He sat. He looked around. He nodded appreciatively at things. She waited. Your letter was rather cold, he said. Finally, my letter was clear, she said. I don't have money to send you. Father, I am not in a position to make financial requests of my husband on your behalf. You're not making a request. I am. He leaned forward. Amelia, I need $800. There's a land opportunity in Kentucky that won't wait. And if I can get in front of it before... No, she said. He blinked. The smile faltered. No. She kept her voice level. I said no in my letter. I'm saying it again now. His expression changed then. Slowly, the warmth receding and something underneath it surfacing, not cruelty. Exactly, but its close cousin, the cold entitlement of a man who had never had to take no from his own daughter before and found the experience genuinely offensive. You understand, he said carefully, that I arranged this marriage. That you are sitting in this house, in this comfort. Because of me. She said, that you traded me to settle your own debt. And I am telling you that the trade is complete. The account between you and Nathaniel is closed. There is no further obligation. I'm your father. Yes, she said. You are. The silence that followed was long and pointed and deeply uncomfortable. She sat in it without flinching, because she had written her letter, and she had meant every word of it, and she was not going to unsay what she had decided. Edward Hartwell looked at his daughter, and then something shifted in his face, something she didn't like at all. We'll see, he said, what Caldwell himself has to say about it. She did not have time to prepare Nathaniel. He came home 2 hours later to find Edward Hartwell installed in his formal sitting room with a glass of the 8's best bourbon and the expression of a man who had decided to make himself comfortable whether invited to or not. Amelia met Nathaniel in the front hall. She had exactly 30 seconds, and she used them efficiently. My father is here. He wants $800 for a Kentucky land venture. I have already said no. He has decided to appeal to you directly. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. His expression was unreadable in the way it got when he was moving very quickly behind a still face. All right, he said. I know. He met her eyes. What do you want me to say to him? The question stopped her. What she wanted, what she had been trained her entire life to believe she was not allowed to want, was for someone to stand beside her and hold the line she had drawn. Not in front of her. Not instead of her, beside her. Tell him the same thing I told him, she said. Exactly that. Nothing more. He nodded. He went into the sitting room. She stayed in the hall just long enough to hear her father's voice lift in greeting Caldwell. Good to see you. Come sit down. I was just telling Amelia. And then she went to the study because she needed to be doing something with her hands, or she was going to pace a hole in the floorboards. She opened a ledger. She stared at it without reading it. 12 minutes passed. Then she heard her father's voice rise, not shouting. Not yet, but the particular pitch that came before it. She closed the ledger. She went back to the sitting room doorway. Her father was standing now. Nathaniel was also standing. The dynamic in the room had shifted from cordial negotiation to something less polished. Not an unreasonable request, her father was saying. The girl is your wife. Her family's stability reflects on your household, Mrs. Caldwell has given you her answer, Nathaniel said. His voice was entirely level. My answer is the same, with respect. Caldwell, I'm not asking her. I'm asking you, man to man. There is no man-to-man conversation to be had here that does not include my wife, Nathaniel said. She manages this household. She manages the accounts. Any financial matter goes through her. Edward Hartwell's eyes found Amelia in the doorway. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, like she was a problem he had created without meaning to, and hadn't yet found the right way to solve. "She manages the accounts," he repeated slowly. "You gave her Caldwell." "She's a woman. She is the most capable person on this property," Nathaniel said. "She is my wife, and she has given you her answer." A pause. "I think it would be best if you rested tonight and made arrangements to return to Richmond tomorrow. We'll have the kitchen prepare supper." The dismissal was courteous and absolute. Her father looked at her again, and she saw the calculation happen in real time behind his eyes. He was reassessing, reordering, figuring out the new shape of the situation. "Of course," he said, finally, with his politician's smile back in place. "Of course. Thank you for your hospitality." He sat back down. He picked up his glass. He looked at Amelia with an expression she didn't trust at all. Supper was the longest meal of Amelia's life. Her father was charming. He was warm and entertaining and told stories about Richmond society that made Ruth and the houseboy laugh from the kitchen doorway. He asked Nathaniel about the estate with what sounded like genuine interest. He commented on the food, the wine, the quality of the furniture. He did not mention money again, which was worse somehow than if he had, because Amelia had grown up with this man, and she knew that when he stopped pushing, it meant he had found a different angle. She just didn't know yet what it was. After supper, Nathaniel excused himself to the study. Amelia stayed at the table with her father because leaving felt like retreat. Edward poured himself another glass of wine. "He's a good man," he said. Almost to himself. "Better than I expected, frankly." "Yes," she said carefully. "And he thinks highly of you." He swirled the glass. "That's good. That's more than I'd hoped for, if I'm honest." She looked at him. "What did you hope for?" He looked up. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw something in his face that was neither the politician's charm nor the gambler's calculation. Something older. Something that might, under better circumstances, have been paternal concern. "I hoped you'd be safe," he said. "Cared for. That's all a father can hope for in the end." She didn't say anything. Because if she opened her mouth right then, what came out would be everything she had been carrying for 4 years, all the grief and the resentment and the love underneath both of them that she had never quite been able to extinguish no matter how much cause he'd given her, and this was not the time for that. This was supper. This was a meal. This was a conversation she needed to finish and walk away from with her dignity intact. "You should," she said. "It's a long ride back to Richmond." He nodded. He finished his wine. At the doorway he paused. "Amelia," he didn't turn around. "I know what I did arranging the marriage the way I did." A long beat. "I told myself it was for you as much as for the family." "I'm not sure I entirely believed that at the time." She sat very still. "Good night, Father," she said. He left. She sat alone at the table for several minutes in the quiet of the emptied room. And she let herself feel the full complexity of loving someone who had failed you, which was not simple and was not clean and did not resolve neatly into either forgiveness or condemnation. Then she folded it back up, she put it away, she went to bed. He was gone by 7 the next morning. She found the note at breakfast brief, her father's hand, saying he had arranged an early departure and thanking them for their hospitality. Nothing about the money, nothing about Kentucky. She handed the note to Nathaniel across the breakfast table without comment. He read it, set it down. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Amelia." She stopped. "I'm not sure what I am." A pause. "I'm not damaged." "If that's what you're asking." He does this. He arrives. He asks. He leaves. It's predictable. Predictable doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, with that expression she had come to know, the real one. The one behind the controlled face, the one that was warm in a way that asked nothing from her in return. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and said, "The winter wheat report came back from the South Field yesterday. Early numbers are good. You were right to do it. You were right to recommend it," he said. "We were both right," she said. "Does that happen often?" Almost a smile. "Not in my experience. Something to work toward." Then she said, and drank her coffee, and felt beneath the ache of the night before, and the complicated residue of her father's presence, something quieter and sturdier that she was slowly learning to trust. The town of Harlow had been watching. Amelia had known this. She had felt it in every trip into town, in every exchange at the market and the dry goods store and Harlan Moore's office. She was the woman who had been bought to settle a debt. And Harlow was the kind of small county where that kind of story became public property. She had managed it by simply being herself, clearly, consistently, without apology, and she had believed, gradually, that it was working. She had been partially right. What she had not accounted for was Randall Hatch. She discovered what he'd been doing on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after her father's visit, when she went into the dry goods store to finalize the renegotiated contract with the owner. A careful man named Patterson, who had always treated her with respectful neutrality. Patterson was behind the counter when she came in. He looked up and something in his expression flickered the faintest hesitation, the smallest recalibration, and she felt it immediately. The way you feel a room change temperature without being able to point to the source. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Patterson." She set the revised contract on the counter. "I've had my husband review the final numbers. He's satisfied with the terms, and I believe they represent fair value for both parties." Patterson looked at the contract. He did not pick it up. "I appreciate that," he said. "Though I wonder if..." "Yes," she said. He was not a man who lied easily. She had noticed this about him. He had the uncomfortable honesty of someone who did not enjoy conflict, but also could not manage sustained deception. "I heard something," he said carefully. "I want you to know I don't put much stock in it." Personally, Amelia kept her face completely neutral. "What did you hear?" "Randall Hatch was in here Monday. He was talking about another stop. He said that Caldwell hired a solicitor to recover funds from Thomas Wren, which everyone knows. But Hatch was saying that the reason Wren was stealing in the first place was because Caldwell he cleared his throat, had agreed to an unusual arrangement with Wren, that the estate was in more financial difficulty than people knew, and that the marriage, he looked genuinely uncomfortable now. He said the marriage was a business arrangement to shore up the Caldwell accounts. That you were brought in because Caldwell needed someone that he'd purchased a manager. Essentially. Silence. Amelia stood completely still. She was aware of the blood in her face, aware of the very precise and controlled way she was keeping her expression from doing what it wanted to do. "He said that," she said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell. I wouldn't repeat it except that he's been saying it in multiple places. And I thought..." He looked at the contract on the counter. "I thought you should know." She picked up the contract. She folded it once. She put it in her bag. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," she said. "I'll be in touch about the revised terms." She walked out of the store. She stood on the street in the October morning and breathed. She was purchased. She was brought in to manage his accounts. She is not a wife. She is a transaction. She is not a person. She is a function. She knew these words. She had been carrying a version of them since the day she walked down that church aisle. But hearing them repeated, hearing that someone was spreading them deliberately, publicly, in a town where she was trying to build something, hit differently than she had anticipated. It hit the place she had been most carefully guarding. Not her pride, not her reputation, her hope. She had been letting herself hope. Quietly, carefully, against her better judgment, she had been opening a door she had spent most of her adult life keeping shut. And standing here on this street, she felt the cold wind blow through it. What if it was never real? What if she had been reading warmth into efficiency and respect into practicality? What if she was the only one building anything? She turned the questions over. She examined them the way she examined a ledger, looking for the lie, looking for the pattern, looking for what was consistent and what didn't add up. And then she thought, I know how to read numbers. I know how to read evidence. And the evidence is not what Randall Hatch is saying. She went home. She sat down in the study. She waited. Nathaniel knew something was wrong the moment he came in at midday. He had learned her, in 8 weeks of marriage, the way you learn a house, by moving through it enough times that you know where the floor shifts and which door sticks and where the light comes from in the late afternoon. He knew her focused silences and her thinking silences, and the particular quality of stillness that meant she was managing something difficult behind a composed face. This was the third kind. What happened, he said. In the doorway, she told him. Directly, cleanly, without editorializing the way she always reported facts that mattered. Patterson's store. Randall Hatch. The words that had been circulating through Harlow for God knew how long. She watched him listen. She watched his expression go still, the dangerous kind of still. Not controlled stillness, but the absolute quiet before something breaks. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. How long has he been saying this? He asked. I don't know, Patterson said Monday, but that may not be the first time. He nodded once. He turned toward the door. Nathaniel. She stood up. What are you going to do? I'm going to find Hatch. And then I'm going to correct the record. Nathaniel. Her voice was sharper than she intended, and she let it be. If you go into town angry and confront him publicly, you're confirming that it got to you, to us. You're giving him what he wants. He stopped. He turned back to look at her. She could see that he knew she was right. She could also see that knowing she was right and accepting it were, at this particular moment, two different things. Then what do you suggest? He said. It came out flat and tight, and she recognized it, the voice of a man who was controlling anger by compressing it. I suggest we go together, she said. Not to confront him. To be visible. To let people see us what we actually are and let that be the answer. That's slower, he said. People will keep repeating it in the meantime. Yes, she said again. They will. And the truth will still be the truth when they're done. She held his gaze. You told your household on the first day that my word carries the same authority as yours. I need you to believe that extends to decisions like this one. The silence stretched between them. He looked at her in the way that she had learned was not performance, was not management, was not the controlled gaze of a man maintaining composure. The look that was simply nakedly. All right, he said. All right, she said. They went to town together that afternoon. They were at the market when Hatch found them. Or rather, when he manufactured a finding. Amelia saw him coming from 20 feet away, and she recognized the particular walk of a man who had planned this encounter in advance, who had seen them from across the square and decided this was his moment. She moved closer to Nathaniel, not behind him, beside him. Caldwell, Hatch said, stopping in front of them. His eyes went to Amelia with that same unhurried boldness. Mrs. Caldwell. Hatch, Nathaniel said. Heard you've had some trouble with the Wren business. Unfortunate. That. A man takes you on in good faith, and then he shook his head with performative regret. The Wren matter is being handled, Nathaniel said. Of course, Hatch's gaze slid to Amelia again. And how are you finding Harlow? Ma'am, settling in well. She looked at him directly. Very well, thank you. Good. He smiled. Must be quite a change from your family situation. Though I suppose any change would be an improvement. Given Mr. Hatch. She kept her voice even. Conversational. Clear. I've heard that you've been speaking about my marriage around town. The smile didn't disappear. But it changed. I've been telling people what's common knowledge, he said. Common knowledge, she repeated. You've been telling people that I'm not a wife. I'm a transaction. That my husband purchased an accountant. Not a partner. Around them, the natural noise of the market had quieted in the gradual way it does when something happens that people want to hear. Hatch's smile held. I've been describing the arrangement as it was set up. Then you've been wrong, she said. Because the arrangement as it exists is a partnership. I manage this estate's accounts. I renegotiated the supply contract. I identified $4,800 in fraudulent record-keeping that your friend Thomas Wren had spent 2 years hiding. A pause. And my husband defers to my judgment on matters ranging from crop rotation to legal strategy. That is not what a purchased manager looks like, Mr. Hatch. That's what a partner looks like. The quiet around them was absolute now. Hatch looked at her. His smile had taken on a fixed quality no longer real, just held in place by habit. I meant no offense, he said. Yes, you did, she said pleasantly. But that's all right. I'm not offended. I'm simply clarifying the record. She turned to Nathaniel. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Open, completely unguarded, something moving through it that he had not prepared and was not managing. She touched his arm lightly, a brief pressure of her hand against his sleeve, and said, "Shall we?" He looked at her for one more second. "Yes," he said. They walked away from Randall Hatch. Behind them, the market noise resumed. But it was different. She could feel it, the shift in the room, the way a story changes direction when the person it's being told about speaks for themselves. She had stood in the middle of the square and told the truth at normal conversational volume, and the truth had been enough. They didn't speak on the ride home. But halfway along the road, Nathaniel reached across and covered her hand with his one brief, firm pressure, no more than 3 seconds, and then withdrew it and looked back at the road. She did not look at him. She looked at her own hand in her lap, where the warmth of his remained, and she thought, this is real. Whatever else is uncertain, this is real. But the real test was still coming. She didn't know that yet. She only knew that when they got home, the house felt different from when they had left it fuller. Somehow, more itself. Mrs. Salt met them at the door with her usual iron-gray composure and the faintest softening around the eyes that on another woman might have been called warmth. "There's a caller, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Arrived an hour ago." "He said he'd wait," Nathaniel said. "He gave his name as Whitmore." A pause. "He says he's from the bank in Richmond." Amelia felt Nathaniel go still beside her. She looked at his face. What she saw there was not fear. It was something worse, the particular expression of for whom the name Whitmore and bank in Richmond arrived together like a confirmation of something he had been dreading for a long time. "Nathaniel, go inside," he said. "I'll handle this." She kept her voice low. "For him only." He looked at her. For a moment, she thought he was going to keep the controlled face in place, going to manage this, the way he had managed everything before she arrived. Alone and behind a wall of composure, but he didn't. "The estate has a mortgage," he said, "taken out after Catherine and the child. I needed capital to keep the property operating. The terms were to begin repayment 18 months after the loan was issued." He stopped. That was 14 months ago. She understood instantly. The way she always understood numbers. 4 months, she said. "Yes." "How much?" "Enough," he said, "that if the harvest numbers from the south field don't improve significantly." He stopped again. She finished the sentence in her own head. "Enough that the estate is in genuine danger." She looked at him, at this man who had kept his household running, who had asked before he took, who had stood beside her in a public square and let her speak for both of them, who had told her from the first day that this was her home, and she felt something crystallize inside her with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. She turned to Mrs. Walker. "Please tell Mr. Whitmore that Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell will be with him shortly," she said. Mrs. Walker's eyes moved to Nathaniel. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Walker said, and went inside. Amelia looked at Nathaniel. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "All of it. Before we go in there." He looked at her for a long moment. And then, for the first time since she had arrived at Caldwell Estate, Nathaniel Caldwell told her everything. The numbers were worse than she had feared and better than she had imagined, which was not reassuring but was at least workable. The loan was $8,000, interest compounded quarterly. The estate's current liquid assets covered approximately 60% of the repayment requirement. The Southfield winter wheat, her Southfield, her decision would cover another 20% of the gap if the yields held. That left a shortfall of roughly $1,600, which was, she realized, almost exactly the amount she had saved the estate through the rent recovery and the renegotiated supply contracts. Almost. She sat across from Moore, a small, precise man who had the demeanor of someone who found numbers more reliable than people and had organized his entire professional life around this preference, and she laid out the estate's financial position with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything. She had been in the room for 8 minutes before Whitmore looked at Nathaniel and said, "Your wife prepared these figures?" "My wife manages our accounts," Nathaniel said. Whitmore looked back at Amelia. "The Southfield projection, is this conservative or optimistic?" "Conservative," she said. "I use the lowest yield numbers from the past decade as my baseline. If the field performs at median historical levels, which early reports suggest it will, the actual number will be roughly 12% higher. And the supply contract savings, these are confirmed? 2 of the 3 are signed. The third will be finalized by the end of the month." She paused. "I can have Patterson write a letter confirming the terms, if that would be useful for your records." Whitmore looked at his own papers, then back at hers. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "if the Southfield performs at even median levels and the third contract closes as you've indicated, the estate will be within $300 of full repayment capacity." "Yes," she said. "$300 is manageable." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "When you took this loan, Mr. Caldwell, the assessment at the time was that the estate was a significant risk." "I know," Nathaniel said. "It is no longer my assessment that it is a significant risk." Whitmore picked up his pen. "I'll recommend a 6-week extension on the repayment commencement date. That should give the Southfield harvest time to close the gap." He glanced at Amelia. "Assuming the yield holds." "It will hold," she said. He looked at her. Then he wrote the extension. Whitmore left at 4:30. The house went quiet in that way it did in the late afternoon, the deep working quiet of a property that had absorbed the day's events and was now simply present with them. Amelia sat at the study desk. The papers from the meeting were still in front of her. She could hear Nathaniel in the hallway, his footsteps. A murmured word to Mrs. Walker, the sound of the front door as one of the farmhands delivered the evening report. She heard all of it, and she didn't move, because she was sitting with something that had no clear name yet. When Nathaniel came into the study, she looked up. He crossed the room. He did not sit. He stood in front of the desk, and he looked at her with the open, unguarded face, the real one, and he said, "You saved this estate today." "I did what the numbers required," she said. She looked at him. "I kept the loan from you," he said. "I should have told you. I should have told you before Whitmore arrived. Before you had to learn it in front of a man from the bank." He stopped. "That wasn't fair to you." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "it wasn't. I thought I could manage it alone. It was an old habit." "I know," she said, "I recognize it." He looked at her. "Something shifted, because you do the same thing," he said. She didn't deny it. "Yes." He stopped. Almost a smile, but waited. "We're both considerably better at handling things alone than we are at asking for help." "We are," she said. "Which is probably why it took you 6 years to realize someone was stealing from you and took me 4 days. That one landed." He laughed. Actually laughed short. Surprise. Real, and she felt the sound of it move through the room the way good things move. Opening something up. She stood up from the desk. She gathered the papers neatly. Efficiently, habit, and she was turning to put them on the shelf when he said, "Quietly, Amelia." He was close, closer than usual. He had crossed the distance between them while she was looking at the papers. And now he was close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes and the complicated gray of his irises and the particular tension in his face that she was beginning to understand was what he looked like when he was not managing anything at all. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I agreed to this marriage," he said, "I told myself it was practical, sensible. I told myself I was done with anything that cost more than I was prepared to pay." He held her gaze. "I was wrong." She didn't move. "I was wrong," he said again. "Because I did not account for you." For he stopped. Found the words slowly, the way a careful man finds them. "For the specific way you read a room. For the fact that you argued me into the winter wheat and you were right. For the way you stood on that street today and told the truth like it was the simplest thing in the world." A pause. "For the question you asked me in the stable." She remembered. "Now I think we may have miscalculated." Her heart was doing the unauthorized thing again. "Nathaniel," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I know," he said. I know what we are to each other on paper. And I know how this started, and I am not asking you." He stopped. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you the truth. Because you have consistently told me the truth, and it seems like the right thing to do." She looked at him. She thought about the question on their wedding night. The ledgers in the morning, the south field, the letter from her father. His hand over hers in the carriage, Whitmore across the desk, writing the extension. She thought about two people who had been braced for the worst and kept finding each other. "You said," she began slowly, "that you married again because you thought you could make it practical. That you were done with anything that cost more than you were prepared to pay." "Yes." "How much?" she said carefully. "Are you currently prepared to pay?" He looked at her for a long moment. The study was quiet around them, the fire low, the light going amber. The whole house holding its breath. "Whatever it costs," he said. She felt something unlock in her chest, not dramatically. Not with tears or declarations, just quietly. Irrevocably. She took a breath. She was about to speak. And then Mrs. Walker appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, with the tone of someone who was genuinely sorry, "but there's a rider at the gate. Mr. Caldwell. He says he has a letter from a Mr. Edward Hartwell." The name landed in the room like a stone. Amelia went very still. Nathaniel looked at her. "He's not done," she said. "No," Nathaniel said quietly. "It doesn't look like he is." She turned to Mrs. Walker. "Bring the letter," she said. The letter was not from her father. That was the first thing Amelia noticed when Miss Walker placed it on the study desk. The handwriting was wrong. Her father's hand was looping and self-important, each letter slightly larger than it needed to be. The signature of a man who believed his words deserved more space than they occupied. This handwriting was small, precise, the handwriting of a clerk or a lawyer. She picked it up, she read it, and the room tilted. "What is it?" Nathaniel said. She set the letter down on the desk and turned it so he could read it. She watched his face as he did watch the controlled expression go very still. Then tighter, then to the particular hardness she associated with him managing something he genuinely did not want to be managing. The letter was from a solicitor in Richmond, a man named Gerald Fitch, representing Edward Hartwell in a claim against the Caldwell estate. The claim was simple and it was devastating. Edward Hartwell was asserting that Nathaniel Caldwell had entered into a verbal agreement at the time of the marriage negotiations. An agreement, Hartwell claimed, that promised him an ongoing financial arrangement in exchange for the Hartwell family name and reputation being joined to the Caldwell estate. He was not asking for $800 anymore. He was asking for $12,000. He was threatening, if the amount was not settled within 30 days, to bring the claim before the county court. Nathaniel read the letter twice. "Set it down. He's lying," he said. His voice was entirely flat. "I know he's lying," Amelia said. There was no verbal agreement. There was a debt settlement. A single payment, nothing more. I know. Fitch is a bottom-rung solicitor who takes cases no reputable firm will touch. Your father found him because reputable firms would have told him his claim has no basis, she said. I know, Nathaniel. I know all of this. She pressed her fingers flat against the desk. The question is what we do about it. He was quiet. We fight it, he said. Of course we fight it. But listen to me. She made him look at her. This goes to court. It becomes public. Everything about how we married. The debt, the arrangement, all of it gets aired in front of a judge and every person in this county who's already been listening to Randall Hatch. Even if we win, she said steadily. The story it tells about us is the story my father has been trying to tell from the beginning. That I was purchased, that this is a transaction, that there is no marriage here. Only a contract. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. So what are you saying, he said. I'm saying, she said carefully, that I need to talk to my father before this goes any further. Directly, without solicitors and without you in the room. He straightened. Absolutely not. Nathaniel, he has already demonstrated that he will use any access to this house as leverage. I am not sending you to Richmond alone to... I didn't say alone, she said. And I didn't say Richmond. She held his gaze. I'm saying I want to write to him tonight and ask him to come here. One conversation. Before this goes to Harlan Moore and turns into a legal battle that drags both of our names through the county courthouse. You think you can change his mind, I think, she said. That I know my father better than any solicitor does. And I think there is something he wants that isn't $12,000. And if I can find out what it actually is, she paused. I might be able to end this without a court ever being involved. Silence. Nathaniel looked at her, that careful, real look. If you can't, then we fight it, she said. And we win. And the story people tell will be the true one. Because by then there will be enough of the truth visible that a lie won't stick to it. He was quiet for a long time. Then, write the letter. She wrote it in 20 minutes. She kept it short, and she kept it without anger, because she understood, had always understood. Even when she resented it, that her father responded to anger by escalating and responded to calm by becoming uncertain. He had spent 53 years surrounded by people who either deferred to him or challenged him. And the thing he had never quite learned to navigate was someone who did neither. She was going to do neither. She sealed the letter and gave it to the writer with instructions to return with her father's answer by morning. She went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Edward Hartwell arrived 2 days later. Without the solicitor, which told her something. He had come alone. That meant he was still negotiating in his own head, still weighing options. Still calculating angles. A man who had fully committed to a legal strategy brought his lawyer everywhere. A man who was still looking for a better deal came alone. She met him in the formal sitting room again. Nathaniel was in the house. She had asked him to stay close. Not in the room, and she could feel his presence in the house the way you feel the presence of something solid and reliable. The way you feel a load-bearing wall. It helped more than she wanted to admit. Her father came in and sat down, and she poured coffee, and she looked at him across the table, and she said, without preamble, tell me what you actually want. He blinked. I told you. The agreement, there was no agreement, and you know it, she said. Fitch is going to take his fee and then tell you in court that a verbal claim with no witnesses and no written record is very difficult to prove against a documented debt settlement. You know this, father. You are not a stupid man. He was quiet. So tell me, she said, what you actually want. Not the number on the letter. What do you want? He looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He stopped. She waited. I'm tired, he said. It came out smaller than she had expected. Older. I'm 53 years old and I'm tired and I made poor decisions and I know I made them and He stopped again. The Kentucky opportunity is real, Amelia. I know how it looks. I know what you think when you hear me say it, but it's real. If I could get in front of it. How much, she said. Do you actually need? Not 12,000, not 800. What is the real number? He looked at her. 2,000, he said. She sat with that. $2,000, not 12. Not the theatrical claim in Fitch's letter. $2,000, which was almost exactly what she had recovered through the Wren case. Almost, all right, she said. Here is what I am able to do. I will speak with Nathaniel about a loan, not a gift. A loan, with terms and a repayment schedule for $1,000. He opened his mouth. 1,000, she said, and in exchange, you will write to Fitch today and instruct him to withdraw the claim. And you will not contact either of us again about money. Not in a year, not in 5 years, not through a solicitor and not through a letter and not by arriving unannounced on this property. She held his gaze. Those are the terms. They are not negotiable. The silence was long. Her father looked at his hands, then at her, and she saw again. That brief, unguarded flash she had seen at the supper table weeks ago, the real man underneath the performance. The tired, smaller man who had made too many wrong turns and was running out of road. You're very like your mother, he said quietly. She could do that too. Look at a person and just see the whole picture. Yes, Amelia said. She could, he nodded slowly. 1,000, he said. With terms. He looked at her. Will he agree to it? Caldwell, I'll ask him, she said. She stood up. She went to the doorway and said, Nathaniel. He came in. She watched him read the room, watched him take in her father's posture. The coffee on the table, the particular quality of the air that meant something had been decided. $1,000, she said. A loan structured repayment. Terms to be drawn up by Harlan Moore in exchange. The claim against the estate is withdrawn today. Nathaniel looked at her father. Then he looked at her. She gave him the smallest nod. I'll have Moore draw up the papers, Nathaniel said. Edward Hartwell let out a breath. Thank you, he said. He said it quietly, without theater, and she recognized it as the closest thing to genuine she had heard from him in years. The letter to Fitch goes today, Amelia said. Before the papers are signed, he looked at her. Today, he agreed. Fitch's withdrawal arrived at Harlan Moore's office the following Tuesday. Moore read it twice, looked up at Nathaniel across his desk, and said, How did you manage this? My wife managed it, Nathaniel said. Moore looked at the withdrawal letter, then at the loan agreement he had drawn up, then at some middle distance that seemed to contain his ongoing reassessment of Mrs. Caldwell. The terms on this loan are quite firm, he said. She set them. Of course she did. He set the papers down. You know, when you married, I heard what people were saying about the arrangement. Most people did, Nathaniel said. Moore paused, chosen his words. I thought it was a sensible match. Practical. Good for the estate. He looked at Nathaniel. I did not think it was what it appears to be, which is. Moore picked up his pen. A genuine partnership. He signed the final document. Those are rarer than people think. Something shifted after that. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or a scene. Nothing that announced itself. But the shift was real, and both of them felt it. And they navigated it the way they navigated most things between them. Carefully, practically, and with the specific attention of two people who had learned to pay attention to each other. Her father left for Richmond 2 days after the papers were signed. She walked him to the carriage. He hugged her briefly, with the awkward sincerity of a man who had never learned to do it naturally, and said, You turned out better than I deserved. She did not agree with him or argue with him. She said, Safe travels, father. She watched the carriage go. She stood in the drive for a moment, with her hands at her sides and the November air cold against her face. And she let herself feel all of it, the grief and the relief and the complicated love that refused to resolve into anything simpler. Then she took a breath and went back inside. Nathaniel was in the study. He looked looked up when she came in. "How are you?" he said. She considered the question genuinely, the way she had learned to do here in this house. "I'm sad," she said. "And I'm relieved. And I think I've been carrying my father's failures for so long that I've forgotten they're his to carry. Not mine." He set down his pen. "You've been carrying a great deal," he said. "So have you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I have." She crossed the room and sat down in the chair she always used, the one across the desk from him. Close enough to pass papers and far enough to maintain the particular working distance they had established. She picked up her pen. "The Southfield report came this morning," she said. "I saw. The yield is projecting at 8% above my conservative estimate. If it holds through the month, we clear the loan by year's end. With margin," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "When you recommended the winter wheat," he said, "I did not believe you. I know. I implemented it because you were compelling and because I had learned enough by then to recognize when someone was more right than me." He paused. "But I did not believe it would work." She looked up. "And now I believe it," he said simply. She held his gaze. And then Mrs. Walker knocked on the study door and said, "Mr. Caldwell, Joseph's back on the fence line, thought you'd want to know. Since you asked to be told when the arm healed up enough for him to work again." Nathaniel stood up. "Tell his mother I'll have Ruth send supper over tonight," he said. "Joseph worked hard this season before he was hurt. He should know it was noticed." Mrs. Walker's expression did what it very occasionally did. "Yes, sir," she said, and went. Amelia watched him reach for his coat. She had not planned to say it. She had been keeping it very carefully in the guarded part of herself, the part where she kept the things that mattered too much to risk. But it came out anyway, quietly, without drama, the way true things tend to come out when you stop managing them. "Nathaniel." He turned. "I didn't marry you because I had to," she said. He went still. "I know the arrangement," she said. "I know what my father did and what you paid and what neither of us chose. But that's the beginning of the story. It isn't the whole story." She kept her voice steady. "And I need you to know that what I've built here, what I've chosen to build, every morning, every decision, every day in this house, I've chosen it. Not because I had to, because I wanted to." The study was absolutely quiet. He crossed back to the desk. He stood across from her, close, the way he had stood in the study the night of Whitmore's visit, and he looked at her with the open face. "The real one. May I ask you something?" She almost smiled. 4 words, the same 4 words that had begun this entire thing. "In a different shape," she said. "When I told you that night in the stable, when I said I thought we may have miscalculated." "Yes. Were you afraid?" he said. She thought about it, gave him the truth instead of the composed answer. "Terrified," she said. "Of being wrong," she said. "Of wanting something and being wrong about whether it was real." He nodded slowly. "And now," he said. She looked at him across the desk where she had spent 4 months of mornings, across the ledgers they had read together, across the length of all the ordinary hours they had filled with attention and work, and the specific language of 2 people learning each other. "Now," she said, "I think it's real." He reached across the desk. He covered her hand with his, not briefly this time. Not 3 seconds and a retreat, but fully, deliberately. A hand that was asking a question without words. She turned her hand over. She held his. "I believe I owe you an apology," he said. "For the things I didn't tell you. The loan. The first months managing everything as if you weren't here to share it. You were afraid too," she said. "Then we're even," she said. Something broke open in his face. Not collapse. Nothing in Nathaniel Caldwell was ever collapse, but the kind of opening that happens when a person has been braced for a long time, and finally is allowed to set it down. The winter came in hard that November. The kind of Virginia cold that settled into the bones of a house and required constant attention. Fireplaces, drafts, the particular management of a large property through the worst months of the year. Amelia had expected to find it difficult. She had grown up in a house that had slowly stopped being able to afford warmth. She found instead that Caldwell Estate in winter had its own rhythms, its own particular life. The workers came to her now with questions the way they'd once gone to Nathaniel. Not instead of him alongside him. Mary and Ruth had stopped treating her like a guest who might leave and started treating her the way you treat someone you are building a life around. Joseph, his arm healed and his pride intact, had taken to leaving the daily fence reports on her desk in the morning before she came downstairs, neatly written in a hand that was clearly making an effort. She had started leaving him book recommendations on the reverse side of his reports. He had started reading them. She discovered this when she came into the study one afternoon and found him sitting on the floor outside the door, deeply absorbed in the third chapter of a surveying manual she had suggested. "I can take it to the bunkhouse," he said, starting to stand. "Don't," she said. "Stay there. The light's better by that window." He looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and settled back down. She went into the study and sat at her desk and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what to call it. She felt at home, not in the way she had been at the Hartwell house, which had always been a place of managing and surviving and shrinking herself to fit the available space. At home in the way that meant this was where she was supposed to be, where she had arrived not by luck or accident, but by the slow accumulation of decisions she had made and held. She was in the middle of the December accounts when she found the second set of discrepancies. Different from the Wren pattern. These were older, buried deeper in the historical records, from before Nathaniel had taken over management of the estate from his father. A different hand, different amounts, but the same essential architecture. Money moving in careful increments from one column to another, across years, in a direction that benefited someone who was no longer part of the household. She sat with it for an hour. Then she picked up her pen and started mapping it. By the time Nathaniel came in from the fields, she had it fully documented 4 years of records. A total discrepancy of just under $7,000. A pattern that pointed with quiet certainty toward his father's former business partner, a man named Corbin who had died 6 years ago and whose estate had therefore put all legal recovery well beyond practical reach. She handed him the papers without preamble. He read them. He stood very still for a long time. "My father trusted Corbin," he said. "For 30 years. "Yes," she said. "I don't believe so. The pattern is too careful. It was designed not to be found." She paused. "I only found it because I was looking for something else, and I recognized the architecture." He set the papers down. He looked at the window. "The recovery," she said gently. "Legally, with Corbin dead and his estate settled, there's no recovery," he said. "No." But she waited until he looked at her. "But you know now. And knowing means you're not carrying something without understanding what it weighs." She paused. "That matters. Even without the money, it matters." He looked at her. "How did you know that was what I needed to hear?" he said. "Because it's what I needed to hear," she said. "When I finally understood that my father's debts were his decisions and not my inheritance." She held his gaze. "The weight doesn't disappear, but you stop carrying it blindly." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room. He sat down in the chair beside her, not across the desk, beside her, and he leaned forward with his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands for just a moment. Not crying, just present with it, letting it be true. She did not speak. She put her hand on his back palm, between his shoulder blades. Still, he took a breath. Then another. Then he straightened and looked at her with red-rimmed eyes that he did not attempt to hide. "Thank you," he said. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She left her hand where it was for another moment. Then she picked up her pen. "The December accounts," she said. "If we close the third supply contract before Christmas, we can make the first loan repayment in January," he said. His voice back to its regular register but softer around the edges. "With a week to spare. He reached across and picked up his own pen. "Then let's close the contract," he said. The night before Christmas, Harlow held its annual gathering at the town hall. Amelia had not attended a Harlow social event since the wedding. She had been visible in town at the market, at Moore's office, at Patterson's store, but always in the context of work, of specific purpose. A gathering was social, which meant it was about display, about what story people were telling about you, and whether you had the nerve to walk into the room where the story was being told. She put on her best dress. She said nothing about any of this to Nathaniel. He came downstairs in a dark coat she hadn't seen before, had perhaps been kept for occasions, and he looked at her and said, He stopped. "You look like yourself." She wasn't sure anyone had ever said that to her before and made it sound like a compliment. "Thank you," she said. The town hall was warm and loud and full of people who paused when the Caldwells walked in. She felt the pause, felt it move across the room in a wave, and she kept her chin level and her shoulders back and her hand lightly on Nathaniel's arm. They were barely through the door before Harlan Moore appeared. His wife on his arm, his sharp eyes taking in both of them with unmistakable satisfaction. "Caldwell." He shook Nathaniel's hand. He turned to Amelia. "I heard the Southfield numbers came in above projection. 8% above," she said. "And the Hartwell claim was withdrawn. Amicably resolved," she said. He almost smiled. "Pat tells me the third contract was signed last week. Thursday," she said. "Good." He nodded. "Good work." His wife, a small woman with intelligent eyes, and the particular warmth of someone who had spent 40 years married to a man who dealt in other people's problems, touched Amelia's arm briefly. "Come meet Mrs. Forsythe," she said. "She's been asking about you." Amelia went. The evening moved in the way that evenings move when such is shifted, when the social story has been revised, and people are still catching up to the new version. She spoke with women who had heard various iterations of her arrival and marriage and were now recalibrating against the actual person standing in front of them. She was direct and warm and entirely herself, and she watched the recalibration happen in real time, woman by woman, and she found that it was less satisfying and more ordinary than she had imagined it would be. What mattered was not being accepted by Harlow. What mattered was knowing who she was, regardless of whether Harlow accepted her. She had figured that out somewhere between the wedding and now. She could not have said exactly when. She found Nathaniel across the room. He was talking to a group of men farmers, from the look of them, and she watched him from a distance. The way you watch someone when they don't know they're being watched. And she saw things she had been too close to see before. The way the other men listened to him, not because he demanded it, because he had earned it. The way he smiled, rarely but real, the way his eyes moved across the room and found her. The way they stayed there. She crossed to him. The men welcomed her into the conversation with the slightly surprised courtesy of people who had not expected to enjoy talking to a woman about Southfield drainage, but were finding, to their evident bewilderment, that they did. Randall Hatch was in the room. She saw him twice, once from across the room, and once when he passed close enough that she could have touched him if she'd reached out. He did not stop. He nodded a small minimal acknowledgement and kept moving. She let him go. There was nothing left to say to Randall Hatch. The story she had needed to correct had been corrected. Not through confrontation, but through time and truth, and the slow visible weight of a life that was real. On the way home, the carriage moved through the cold night air, and Nathaniel sat across from her with a quiet expression and the look of a man who had had a better evening than he had expected. "Mrs. Forsythe invited us to dinner in the new year," Amelia said. "I heard. Moore's wife is on the county charitable committee. She asked if I'd be interested in joining. What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She paused. "I said yes." He almost smiled. "That's not thinking about it. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds," she said. "That counts." The carriage turned onto the Caldwell Drive, and she felt the familiar shift that she had come to associate with coming home, the specific quality of return. The sense of a place that held her rather than simply contained her. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something, all right." She looked at him across the carriage, this man she had married in fear and found, against every expectation, to be the safest place she had ever stood. "I am not afraid anymore," she said. "Of us. Of what we are." She held his gaze. "I wanted you to know that." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know. How?" He said quietly. "You stopped watching the door." She thought about that. He was right. She had stopped watching the door. Stopped keeping one eye on the exit. One part of herself always ready to manage a retreat. She had somewhere between the ledgers in the south field, and the morning breakfasts, and the hand on his back in the study, she had simply stopped. She had stopped because she had stopped needing to. The carriage stopped. He got out and offered her his hand, the formal gesture. The same one he had offered on the first day, and she took it. The same as she had then, except that everything about the taking was different. Less like a truce and more like a choice. They walked into the house together. Mrs. Walker had left the hall lamp burning. The house was warm and quiet and entirely itself, and so, Amelia thought, was she. She was entirely herself. For the first time in longer than she could measure, she was standing in the right place, wearing no armor she hadn't chosen, carrying nothing she hadn't agreed to carry. Nathaniel hung his coat. He turned to her. "I have something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. She looked at him. "It's been 4 months," he said. "And I am aware that our beginning was not." He paused. "It was not what either of us would have chosen." "No," she said. "But if I were choosing now," he stopped. "I would choose this. I would choose." Voice dropped. "I would choose you." The hall was very quiet. Outside, the December wind moved through the old oaks. Inside, the lamp threw its steady orange light. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "Ask me," she said. He stepped forward. "May." "Yes," she said, before he finished, before he had to. Because this time she was choosing too. He put his hands on her face carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything, and he looked at her for one more moment with the open face. The real one, the one that had no armor left in it. And then he kissed her. It was not dramatic. It was not what she would have described in a story, no crash of feeling, no overwhelming wave. It was something quieter than that and more permanent. Like a door closing behind you when you have finally walked into the room you were always meant to be in. She put her hand against his chest. She felt his heart. Fast. She realized with a warmth that moved all the way through her that he was as afraid as she had been, and as certain, and as completely and irrevocably committed to this to her as she was to him. She leaned into him. He held her. They stood in the hall of Caldwell Estate in December of 1817, two people who had come to each other through debt and fear and convention, and the worst possible beginning, and they were entirely, simply, present. "I have to tell you something," he murmured against her hair. "The south field was your idea," he said. "I want that on record." She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, and it came out real and warm and surprised. And she felt him smile against her hair. "It's already in the ledger," she said. "Good," he said. "Moore already suspects." "Good," he said again. She stayed where she was. She thought, this is what it is. This is what it was always going to be, from the moment he stopped and asked. She thought, all the terrible beginning was just the road to here. And here finally, irrevocably, completely was home. January came in cold and clear and full of consequence. The first loan repayment to Whitmore's bank went out on the 8th of the month, exactly as Amelia had projected. With 6 days to spare, she handed Nathaniel the receipt when Moore's messenger delivered it. And he looked at it for a long moment without speaking. And she watched something move through his face that she recognized, because she had felt the same thing the day Fitch's withdrawal letter arrived. Relief that had been held so long it had forgotten it was relief. "On schedule," she said. "On schedule." He folded the receipt, put it in the desk drawer, looked at her. "What does the February projection look like?" "Better," she said. "The third contract closed at better terms than I estimated. If the winter sales hold, February's repayment will be early too." He leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "when Whitmore came in November, I was genuinely uncertain whether the estate would survive the year." "I know," she said. "I could tell. You didn't say anything. You needed someone to help you solve it," she said. "Not someone to confirm that it was serious." She picked up her pen. "You already knew it was serious." He looked at her for a long moment with the open face, the one she had stopped being startled by, the one she had started looking for. "You do that," he said. "Do what?" "Understand what people need," he said. "Without being told." She considered this. "My mother did it better," she said. "I learned from watching her manage my father for 20 years, without either of them acknowledging that she was the one keeping everything together." She paused. "I decided early on that I would do it differently. That I would do it in the open. So that people knew," he said. "So that I knew," she said. "So I never forgot that what I contributed was real." He was quiet. "I won't forget it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." She went back to the accounts. He went back to the planting schedule. Outside, the January wind moved through the old oaks, and the house was warm, and the work continued. And this ordinary, purposeful, mutual morning was the thing she had not known she was building toward. This was the thing that had been waiting at the end of all the terrible beginning. She didn't say that out loud. She didn't need to. The letter from Clara arrived on a Tuesday in late January. Amelia recognized her sister's handwriting, immediately smaller than their father's. Rounder, the handwriting of someone who had been careful and contained since childhood, because careful and contained was the only safe way to be in the Hartwell house. She read it at the breakfast table after Nathaniel had ridden out. Clara was in Richmond, living with a cousin. She was well, she said. She was working as a seamstress for a dressmaker on Commerce Street. She was saving money. She wrote carefully around the subject of their father, neither condemning nor defending. The way you write around a wound that hasn't fully healed. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "I heard what happened with father and the solicitor. I heard you handled it. I am not surprised. I always knew you would figure out how to land on your feet. Amelia, I just didn't know you'd land somewhere that actually looked like home." Amelia read that last line 3 times. She put the letter in her pocket. When Nathaniel came in at midday, she said, "I'd like to invite my sister for a visit. If you're willing." He hung his coat, "Of course. She's been in Richmond. She's been managing on her own. Then she's been doing something difficult," he said. "And she should have somewhere to rest." He looked at her. "Write to her today. Tell her she can come whenever she's ready." Amelia looked at him. "You don't know her," she said. "No," he said simply. "But she's yours. That's enough." She turned back to her desk before her face did something she hadn't given it permission to do. She picked up her pen. She wrote to Clara. The visit that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of February. And it had nothing to do with Clara, who hadn't arrived yet. Amelia was in the study when she heard voices at the front door. Mrs. Walker's and a woman's she didn't recognize, with a tension in them that brought her out of the study and into the hall before she had consciously decided to move. The woman at the door was perhaps 60, with a straight spine and silver hair, and the kind of face that had been beautiful once and had chosen authority instead of trying to hold on to beauty past its season. She wore good traveling clothes, and she was looking at Mrs. Walker with the expression of someone who was accustomed to being admitted to places without argument. She looked past Mrs. Walker and found Amelia in the hall. "You must be the new wife," she said. Amelia looked at her steadily. "I am Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "And you are?" "Margaret Caldwell," the woman said. "Nathaniel's mother." The silence that followed was exactly 3 seconds long. "Mrs. Walker," Amelia said, without looking away from the woman at the door. Please tell Mr. Caldwell his mother is here and have Ruth put on coffee. Yes. Ma'am, Mrs. Walker said, with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular storm to arrive and was relieved it was finally here. Margaret Caldwell did not waste time on pleasantries. She sat in the formal sitting room, the same chair Edward Hartwell had occupied 3 months ago. Amelia noticed, and she looked around the room with the proprietary attention of a woman assessing something that had once been hers. The room looks different, she said. I rearranged it in November, Amelia said. The original arrangement blocked the heat from the fireplace. Margaret looked at her. Practical. Yes, Amelia said. My son married you in July, Margaret said. I heard in August. I'm sorry you weren't informed sooner. Are you? Yes, Amelia said. I am, whatever the circumstances of our marriage. You are his mother. You should have been told. Margaret looked at her with the careful, unhurried assessment of a woman who had been managing people and situations for 60 years and had developed a very precise instrument for detecting nonsense. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? A girl, Margaret said. Frightened, grateful, willing to disappear into this house and cause no trouble. I'm 26, Amelia said. And I'm not frightened of you, if that's what you're determining. No, Margaret said. I can see that. Pause, should you be? I don't know yet, Amelia said. I've just met you. Something moved across the older woman's face. Not quite a smile. The Hartwell family, she said. Your father is Edward Hartwell. Yes, I know of him, she said. Not favorably. Most people who know of him don't, Amelia said. I understand that. And yet you managed to extract yourself from his latest scheme. Amelia looked at her. You heard about that. I hear most things eventually, Margaret said. A solicitor named Fitch filed and withdrew a claim against this estate within 3 weeks. In Harlow. People talk. She set down her coffee. My son did not handle it. We handled it together, Amelia said. I was told you handled it. Amelia didn't correct her. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Catherine the first Mrs. Caldwell was a gentlewoman, she said. Kind. She loved my very much. A pause. She was not equipped for the weight of this estate. It was too much for her. She spent 3 years trying to be something she wasn't, and she stopped. I always believed that part of what happened to her was the weight of trying. Amelia was very still. I'm sorry, she said. About the child. Margaret looked at her hands. My son carries it. He always, she looked up. Are you equipped for the weight of this estate? I think so, Amelia said. I've been managing it for 7 months. I know, Margaret said. I've heard the South Field. Winter wheat, Amelia said. It was good decision, Margaret said. My husband planted tobacco through that field for 15 straight years and never understood why the yield kept dropping. She looked at Amelia directly. He was not a man who listened to people who knew better than him. Nathaniel is, Amelia said. The silence that followed was long. Yes, Margaret said finally. He is. It took him longer than it should have, but he is. The door opened and Nathaniel came in. He stopped when he saw his mother. Something passed between them quick. Complicated. The entire compressed history of a mother and a son who had spent years loving each other across a distance neither of them had fully acknowledged. Mother, he said. Nathaniel, she stood. You look better than the last time I saw you. When was the last time? 2 years ago. You looked like a man who had forgotten why he was doing any of it. She glanced at Amelia. You don't look like that now. He looked at Amelia too. No, he said, I don't. Margaret picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. I'll stay 3 days, she said. I'd like to see the South Field and the accounts before I go. If Mrs. Caldwell is willing to show me, Amelia met the older woman's eyes. I'll have everything ready in the morning, she said. Margaret nodded once. She walked past Nathaniel toward the door and paused. She'll do, she said, not to him, to the room. Then she went upstairs. Nathaniel looked at Amelia. Are you all right, he said. Your mother, she searched for the word. Formidable, yes. I like her, she said. He blinked. Most people find her difficult. Amelia said, turning back to the study, are not used to women who say exactly what they mean. She heard him almost laughed behind her. She kept walking. The 3 days with Margaret Caldwell were the most instructive of Amelia's life at the estate. The older woman moved through the house the way you move through a place you built, and then left reclaiming each room by attention, reassessing each change by visible measure. She was not sentimental about what Amelia had altered. She was not defensive about what had been done before. She asked questions and she listened to answers, and she offered observations with the precise brevity of someone who had no patience for anything beyond what was actually useful. On the second morning, she sat across from Amelia at the study desk, and they went through the accounts together. Margaret had managed this estate for 20 years before her husband died, and Nathaniel took over. And she understood the records in the bone-deep way that Amelia understood them, not just the numbers, but the story the numbers told about the decisions behind them. She found the Corbin discrepancy in 40 minutes. Amelia had taken 4 days. You found it, Margaret. Not surprised. Just noting, it took me longer, Amelia said. You didn't know what you were looking for, Margaret said. I did. I suspected Corbin for years. I could never prove it. She set down the ledger. My husband didn't want me to look, but you looked anyway. I'm not a woman who stops looking because someone tells her not to, Margaret said. No, Amelia said, I can see that. Margaret looked at her. You're not either, she said. No, Amelia agreed. A pause. He needed you, Margaret said. She wasn't speaking about Corbin anymore. My son. Not a wife, though he needed that too. He needed someone who could stand beside him and not disappear under the weight. She looked at the window. Catherine couldn't. It wasn't her fault. She simply wasn't built for it. And after she was gone, I was afraid he would never... She stopped. I was afraid he would build walls so high that nothing real could get in. He asked before he took, Amelia said. Margaret looked at her. On our wedding night, Amelia said. He asked. I said no, and he sat in the chair and worked his accounts and never made me feel like I had done something wrong. She paused. I knew from that night that the walls weren't what I thought they were. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. His father never asked for anything, she said. He simply took and called it his right. A pause. I spent 30 years with a man who believed ownership was the same as love. I know the shape of that, Amelia said. Yes, Margaret said. I imagine you do. They sit together in the quiet study, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two women who had each spent a significant portion of their lives being underestimated by men who should have known better, and who had found through different roads, across a generation, the same understanding. That endurance was not the same as defeat. That strength worn quietly was still strength. That a person's worth did not diminish because someone with power failed to see it. Take care of him, Margaret said. We take care of each other, Amelia said. Margaret looked at her. Then she almost smiled, a real one this time. Small and sharp and warm. Good, she said. That's exactly right. Margaret left on the 4th morning. She hugged Nathaniel at the door with the particular economy of a woman who had learned to compress large feelings into small gestures. Firm. Brief, real. She shook Amelia's hand, then she held it. Come to Richmond in the spring, she said. I want to introduce you properly. Not as Nathaniel's wife, as yourself. Amelia looked at her. I'd like that, she said. Margaret released her hand. Stepped into the carriage. Was gone. Nathaniel stood beside Amelia on the drive and they watched the carriage until it was out of sight. She approves of you, he said. She approves of the South Field decision, Amelia said. I think I come secondary. She told me last night, he said, that you were the best thing to happen to this estate in 20 years. Amelia was quiet. She also told me, he continued, that if I ever managed you the way my father managed her, she would come back and review the accounts herself. Amelia turned to look at him. Your mother, she said, is my favorite person in this county. He laughed. Real, easy, the laugh she had been slowly collecting all these months. every rare instance of it, keeping them without meaning to. They went back inside. Clara arrived in the second week of February. She came on the afternoon coach from Richmond, with one trunk and the careful composure of someone who had been holding themselves together for a long time and was not entirely certain it was safe to stop. She was 23. She looked like Amelia and didn't same brown hair, same steady eyes, but where Amelia had learned to take up space, Clara had learned to minimize it. She stood in the front hall of Caldwell Estate with her trunk at her feet and looked around with the expression of someone trying not to be overwhelmed and not entirely succeeding. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said. "It's manageable," Amelia said. "Once you know where everything is, which you do, which I do." Clara looked at her sister, really looked. The way you look at someone you have been worried about from a distance and are now assessing up close. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find it. Because something in her face eased. "You look well," she said. "I am well," Amelia said. "That's not the same as looking it." Clara touched her arm briefly. "But you look it too." Nathaniel appeared from the study doorway. Clara looked at him. He nodded at her. "Miss Hartwell." "Welcome." She blinked, like she had been braced for something more formal and was recalibrating. "Mr. Caldwell." "Thank you, no need," he said simply. "You're welcome here for as long as you want." He went back into the study. Clara looked at Amelia. She paused. "Not what Amelia said." "He isn't. The stories I heard in Richmond were half true at best," Amelia said. "Come, I'll show you your room." She took her sister upstairs and showed her the room she had prepared, the East Room, with a good afternoon light and the view of the kitchen garden that was already starting to show the first suggestion of spring. She had put flowers on the table, because Clara had always noticed flowers, and she had put a book on the pillow because she knew what her sister liked. Clara picked up the book. She set it back down. She sat on the edge of the bed. "Amelia, are you happy?" The question landed simply. Without armor, Amelia stood in her sister's doorway and looked at the person who had known her longest in the world. And she considered the question with the full attention it deserved. "Yes," she said, "really." She paused. "I didn't think I would be. I thought the best I could hope for was manageable. Survivable. I thought I would find a way to exist here and make myself useful and keep enough of myself intact that I didn't lose track of who I was." She looked at Clara. "I got more than that." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said, in a voice that had a lot more in it than the single word. "How are you?" Amelia said. "Honestly." Clara looked at her hands. "Tired. It's been a long year. Father's situation. And then not knowing what happened with you, and Richmond is." She stopped. "Richmond is fine. It's not home." "Then stay," Amelia said. "As long as you need to. I don't want to be a burden." "Clara." Amelia crossed the room and sat beside her sister on the edge of the bed. "You have spent your entire life trying not to be a burden to people who made you feel like you were one. You are not a burden. You are my sister. Those are different things." Clara was quiet. Then her composure did what composure does when you finally put it down somewhere safe. She put her face in her hands and she cried, not dramatically, not loudly, just the real thorough crying of someone who has been holding it in for far too long. Amelia put her arm around her. She did not say it was all right. She did not say don't cry. She just held her, the way she had learned to hold difficult things steadily, without flinching, for as long as it took. Spring came to Caldwell Estate in the way that spring always comes, gradually. Then all at once, the Southfield showed its full yield in March. And the numbers were better than even Amelia's median projection. She put the final figures on Nathaniel's desk on a Tuesday morning and watched him read them and watched the expression on his face that she had been waiting for, not relief this time, but something past relief. Something that looked like the future becoming real. "We're ahead," he said. "By $400 over projection," she said. which means the February payment covered the full installment, and the March payment will complete the year's obligation ahead of schedule. He set the paper down. He looked at her. "You were right," he said. "About the south field. About the wheat." "I know," she said. "I want that on record." "It's already in the ledger," she said. Third column, February page. He reached out and took her hand across the desk. Not the brief 3-second contact of the carriage. Not the careful, managed gesture of two people learning the distance between them. A full, deliberate, unhurried holding. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you if you'd be willing to let this be fully real," he said. Not practical. Not a partnership of accounts and management and shared responsibility. He paused. "I know that's what it started as. I know it's what we both told ourselves it was." He held her gaze. "But I don't want to tell myself that anymore." She was quiet. "What do you want to tell yourself?" she said. "I want to tell myself," he said carefully, "that I am in love with my wife." The study was absolutely silent. Amelia looked at this man, this serious, honorable, quietly funny, stubbornly careful man who had asked before he took and listened when she spoke, and stood beside her in a public square and let her be exactly who she was, and she felt the locked door open all the way. Not the cautious crack of part one, not the gradual widening of everything that had come since. All the way. "Then tell yourself that," she said, "because it's true." And because she turned her hand over in his. "I am in love with you." He looked at her. He said nothing. He did not need to. He stood up and he came around the desk, and he took her face in his hands, the same way he had in December. He kissed her the way a man kisses someone, when he is not managing anything at all, when there is no armor and no performance and no careful distance. Just him. Just her. Just this. Outside, Joseph was working the east. Inside, Mrs. Walker was directing the spring cleaning with her usual iron authority. Clara was in the kitchen garden. From Ruth, how to tell which seedlings were worth keeping. The estate was alive around them, working, breathing. Fully itself, and at the center of it, in the study where they had spent the better part of a year, building something neither of them had known how to ask for. Amelia Caldwell held her husband's face in her hands and chose him back. Harlan Moore's spring dinner was in April. Moore's wife had planned it for 2 months, and the guest list was half of Harlow County, the farmers and merchants and their wives. The people who had watched the Caldwell story evolve from whispered transaction to something they were still finding words for. Amelia wore the blue dress. She had bought the fabric in February with her own money she had earned. She had told herself, through the supply contracts, and Ruth had helped her make it up. And it fit like something she had chosen rather than inherited. She came downstairs, and Nathaniel looked at her from the hall and said, "You look like yourself. You always say that," she said. "It's always true," he said. She took his arm. They walked into Moore's dinner, and the room received them the way a room receives something it has finally figured out what to make of, with the slightly sheepish warmth of people who had been wrong and were now gradually being right. Randall Hatch was not there. She noticed his absence with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped requiring his presence to confirm anything. Mrs. Forsythe found her within minutes and said, "I heard about the Southfield numbers." Patterson told half the county. They were good numbers, Amelia said. They were extraordinary numbers, Mrs. Forsythe said. For a field that was half dead 2 seasons ago. She looked at Amelia directly. "How did you know?" "I listened to the men who worked it," Amelia said. They knew. They'd been watching it for years. They just needed someone to take what they knew seriously. Mrs. Forsythe looked at her for a moment. "You are not what I expected," she said. "When you first came." "I know. What I expected," Mrs. Forsythe said, was someone managing. Getting through. She paused. "What I see is someone who has made something real." Amelia looked across the room to where Nathaniel stood with Moore and 2 of the county farmers, talking with the engaged attention he brought to everything that mattered. She watched him listen, watched him respond. watched him glance across the room and find her the way he always found her. Quietly, without theater, and hold for just a moment before looking back. Yes, she said. That's what it is. Not what it became despite everything. Not what survived the arrangement. Not what emerged from the transaction despite its worst intentions. What they had built, deliberately, daily, through ledgers and arguments and a letter to a solicitor and a hand on a back in a dark study and wheat planted in a field everyone else had given up on. What they had chosen. She stood in the south field on a May afternoon, 6 weeks after Moore's dinner, with the last of the winter wheat coming up strong, and the spring planting already underway in the adjoining section. And she thought about the woman who had walked down that church aisle in July of the previous year. That woman had been certain her life was over. She had been wrong. Not because a man had saved her. Not because the circumstances had resolved themselves with convenient grace. Not because wealth had turned out to be comfortable and comfort had turned out to be love. She had been wrong because she had been the one to save herself. She had opened the ledgers. She had found the discrepancies. She had renegotiated the contracts and written the letter to her father and stood in the town square and spoken the truth at conversational volume and sat beside her sister while she cried and shown Margaret Caldwell the accounts and planted the winter wheat in a field everyone else had abandoned. She had done all of it, and Nathaniel had done all of it with her. That was the difference, the one she had not known to look for. Not a man who rescued her, a man who stood beside her. A man who had asked before he took from the very first night, and had gone on asking, consulting, considering, deferring, listening every morning since. A man who had trusted her with his ledgers and his grief and his mother and his confession in the study and the whole complicated weight of a life that needed someone to share it. She heard him come up behind her. She didn't turn. The east section is responding well, he said. I know. I checked it this morning before I was up. You were awake, she said. You were just pretending not to be. A pause. Major needs shoeing, he said. I keep forgetting to send for the farrier. I sent for him yesterday, she said. He's coming Thursday. Pause. What would I do? He said. Without you knowing everything before I do. She turned to look at him. He was standing close, his coat open in the May warmth, with the look of a man who had everything he needed and knew it. You'd manage, she said. Yes, she agreed. Probably. He held out his hand. She took it. They stood in the south field together, the field she had saved with 2 seasons of patience and the willingness to be right in the face of doubt, and the spring afternoon went on around them. Unhurried and full and entirely real. I have been thinking, she said. About what? The Corbin discrepancy. The missing 7,000. She looked at the field. We won't recover it legally. No, but the south field will produce that amount. Above operating costs over the next 4 years at current yield rates. She paused. So in practical terms, we're recovering it. Just slowly. He was quiet. That's one way to look at it, he said. It's the true way, she said. The numbers don't lie. They don't. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, and that was the whole of it, that small, ordinary, deliberate gesture between 2 people who had come to each other through the worst possible door and built, on the other side of it, something that neither debt nor arrangement, nor her father's schemes, nor the county's gossip, nor the weight of old grief had managed to touch. Something real, something chosen, something that did not require anyone's permission to exist. Amelia Caldwell stood in her south field in the spring of 1818, holding her husband's hand, and she was exactly, completely, irrevocably herself, and that was the whole story. Not the forced marriage, not the debt, not the question asked in the dark on a terrifying wedding night. Though that question had been where it started, had been the crack of light through a door she hadn't known was there. The whole story was this: 2 people who had been braced for the worst and found, instead, each other, who had built trust out of ledgers and arguments and small daily choices. who had learned, over the long months of an ordinary life, that love was not a feeling that arrived, it was a decision that held. Every morning, every day, and freely kept.